When I was rereading Autobiography of a Yogi in preparation for today's talk, I was very struck by the fact that Yogananda actually spends 2 full chapters talking about great scientists, in both cases very saintly men or saints. In fact, one of them, Luther Burbank, the great horticulturist, plant physiologist, he actually dedicated his book to as an American saint. Actually, it's fairly early in his book, Yogananda's book, when you come to J.C. Bose. And Jagadish Chandra Bose actually shows up as the 8th chapter, and it's right after the levitating saint. So you've gone through the first 7 chapters and your mouth is sort of hanging open with everything you've read, almost with incredulity, and suddenly, boom, you're rooted back down into the practical world and how spirituality and practicality intersect. You know, I found it a very odd thing that our very term scientist as an occupation stems from a humorous article that was published in 1834 where a philosopher was talking about people who studied different science-type pursuits, geology and other areas of natural history. And since we called people who studied art, who painted, sang, things like that, we called them artists, that maybe people who study science should be called scientists. And he actually meant it as a pejorative or derisive term. In fact, up until that point, if you studied one of the sciences, you were considered a natural philosopher. And there was a much greater intersection between religion and spirituality and the natural sciences. And so if you went back to Newton, who did his writing of calculus and really the foundation of our modern classical physics, comes from him. He was just before the start of Dwapara Yuga. If you advance forward to Darwin, who published his work right at the beginning of the Civil War in the United States, right around the early 1860s, which, by the way, is when Lahiri met with Babaji, right at the time of the Civil War. Isn't that an interesting coincidence? So I think if you went to either one of those scientists and said, well, now you've done this scientific thing, and that really has nothing to do with God and spirituality correctly. Well, I think Newton, who was a very cantankerous fellow, probably would have grabbed the nearest object and chucked it at you because you were being such a fool. And even Darwin, I have a feeling Darwin, who's a little more shy and retiring, might look at you and with great disappointment say, "You missed the point of my work." Because both of them, as natural philosophers of those times, saw the work they did as part and parcel of the spiritual search, that it was theirs to explore God in creation and God's manifestation in creation. And somehow, since 1834, it's devolved into this thing where it's supposed to be separate from religion. I was very much taken with 2 thoughts when I was meditating on this topic, and the first one was about Kriya practice itself from the Gita, as Yogananda explained it, was even a little practice of this inward religion will free you from dire fears and colossal sufferings. And then later, thinking on his life and the start of, as Jyotish explained, the 3rd wave, when at that garden party in Beverly Hills, he sent out into the ether this thought form to start independent colonies based on living for God and living simply. And I think there's actually a tremendous intersection here. And as we talk about accelerating human evolution, I think both things are important. The Kriya Yoga technique and this concept of living in community with others, also practicing Kriya. And as it turns out, as we talk today, you'll see that, yes, with Kriya Yoga practice, there is an individual evolution of our form in preparation for God realization, and we're going to go through all the details of that, including the nervous system and our genetic structure. But it turns out we're actually influencing everyone around us with the changes that we are going through, both neurologically and genetically. And the same it is as it is for us, that these people around us are influencing us neurologically and genetically. So living in a community where you have a chance to bump shoulders with people who are doing the exact same process as you are dealing with the same kind of issues you are in your life, and seeing how they handle it and they respond to things is having an influence on you. And we're going to go into this in a little detail. You know, when Master or Swami would talk about consciousness and our physical reality, they would often use the example of an ocean. That if you want to look just at physical reality, you'd start by looking at just the surface of the ocean. And if it's a particularly windy or blustery day, and there you are in your little physical rowboat on the surface of this ocean of consciousness, that you could be tossed around. Your biggest concerns may trying to keep your food dry and yourself not to get wet or get seasick. And that our physical lives exist at this more superficial level. But if we go down even 20 feet, suddenly we're down to a deeper level, which is much calmer. I think the way Yogananda would have described that, going down into a greater depth in terms of consciousness, would be to entering the realm of prana, of life force. And in fact, it's very interesting. One of the things that Yogananda did is he would use the term when talking about material things, is he would say we are made up of protons and electrons. And when we talk about prana, life force, which is a different form of energy, which is not a physical energy, it's a life force, pranic, subtle energy, he would talk about lifetrons as the particles that make up prana. And as we go deeper and deeper into this ocean of consciousness, we emerge into the field of thought, or thoughttrons. Make that up. And beyond that, we finally are deep enough where we're to pure consciousness itself. And all we feel is the great ecstasy and bliss of God. And Om reverberates, booms around us, and that is our reality. Space melts away, time melts away. You know, I had a very curious experience the other day. I was out running some errands in town, and I just happened to put in a CD of one of Yogananda's talks that I had actually not heard before. And I looked at it before I put it in, and I just noticed it was 2 months before I was born, in 1951. It was the end of one of their Christmas meditations at Mount Washington. And I started listening to this talk, and I realized after 2 or 3 minutes that Master just had this ecstatic, blissful energy in his voice, and it was transfixing. And here I was trying to drive my car down the road, and I kept getting sort of drawn into this where I'd want to start interiorizing, like when we do Kriya. And I thought, well, how interesting that that's happening. And I'd like to go into that a little bit more about neurologically some of the things that might have been happening with that. But I realized that I was going to have to make a choice at that point, and it was either pull over, listen to the whole talk and meditate for a while, or maybe, because I actually had some appointments I had to get to, do it in little 3 and 5 minute sections. And I realized after about 15 or 20 minutes of this talk, every time I would listen to it, that I realized it wasn't what he was saying, that he could have been giving the weather report. But there was this consciousness of God's ecstasy, and there wasn't a scintilla of yearning in it. It was union. I am with God. There is nothing left I must strive for. There's nothing left that I must want. I have it already, and I give it to you. But much of what we do in the sciences is to deal with what's happening at the surface of this little ocean of consciousness. Even though we may know there are things happening more deeply in this ocean, much of what we do is trying to help people stay drier, keep their food dry, and not get seasick. You know, Yogananda said a very profound thing. He said, the road to God is through our own nervous system. He actually said that in the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam in his explanation of it. And elsewhere, he said, remember that the brain and nervous system are the altar of the spirit. And that really this process that we go through with Kriya Yoga is to accelerate this transformation of our nervous system so that we can transmit and transmute the billion watts of spiritual power that come to us in deeper meditation. And frankly, if that kind of power comes to us before our nervous system is prepared, it is a very thrilling experience, and I don't mean thrilling in necessarily a good way. So we do have to go through a process of transformation, of evolution, in fact. Well, how does this happen? How does this process happen? Well, in the chapter on Kriya Yoga, he mentions that really, if you took an individual and said, all right, just by living rightly, how long would it take you to realize God and be able to merge back into God? And he said, basically, the minimum would be sort of 1 million years. And in fact, that's actually really understating how long it takes. That in fact, it's really more like 2 million or more. I had a feeling when I wrote that in fact it's much longer than that, and he just didn't want to discourage people too much that it takes that long. But that's with living rightly. I mean, we're living in a situation here at Ananda and in our Ananda communities where we're living rightly, and we're trying to do things rightly, and we're trying to obey the laws of good health, eat the daily diet as Master recommended to us. But we also have Kriya Yoga. And this is the accelerant. This is the catalyst that allows us to grow much more rapidly. And as Parvati was mentioning, he said that with even a few years of Kriya Yoga practice, if you could do them perfectly and could meditate for 8 to 12 hours a day, you could actually do that 1 million years in 3 years by just doing your Kriya Yoga practice. For most of us, I think it's going to take quite a bit longer, but not as long as we probably expect. Well, what parts of the nervous system are at play in this whole process? Well, it turns out, and I'm going to pick up my brain model here. Actually, when I was getting ready this morning, my brain model asked if he could wear my Bose headphones in celebration of J.C. Bose. And I thought, well, you know, I hate to tell you this, but I don't think they were probably related. And he said, well, actually, that wasn't it. I just didn't want to hear your talk. So I have to have some humor. Okay. So I'm holding up my brain model. This is just like my brain is oriented in my head. And remember, Ananda mentioned this briefly in her talk on Tuesday, that the most anterior part of the brain, this area that's right behind your forehead, is the frontal lobes of the brain. And the most anterior portion of that is prefrontal lobes. And this is the part of our brain that we're really activating as part of our Kriya practice physiologically. Not talking about the subtle energy centers at this point. That's kind of one level deeper than we're going to go today. I'm just going to talk about plain neurological physiology. So that's the frontal lobes. And I'm going to take the outer part of the brain off. And you can see this sort of half-moon shaped structure here, Well, we call that the limbic system. The limbic system is called that because it's shaped like a half moon. Most of the structures in the brain are named by what they looked like long before we knew what they did. You know, by the way, just in this last year, there have been more centers mapped in the brain, and 100 new centers were just mapped in the brain this last year. It was really a big deal in my literature that I read, that we're understanding more about areas of the brain that we thought didn't do anything. I always love that when they say, you know, this is a junk area of the brain, or it's junk DNA, or yeah, this hormone that we just found doesn't do anything. And there's a part of me that always just catches that and go, ha ha ha, let's wait 10 years, let's wait 20 years. And, you know, I recommend melatonin for sleep for many of my older patients particularly. And when I was a medical student, they said it was a endogenous hallucinogen, means your brain produced it, but it doesn't do anything. And I remember I thought, melatonin, it does something. Okay, so this is limbic system. Limbic system is the part of our brain that deals with instinctual function and with more basic emotion things like fear, panic, anger. And it's kind of our built-in functional safety net that lets us stay out of trouble and reproduce, but not much more than that. And it turns out that the frontal lobes of the brain, as we activate them during our Kriya practice, in fact, any meditative practice does this, but Kriya is particularly good this way, is it begins to transfer the function of our brain away from being more limbic system focused further forward in the brain to these higher brain centers. This part of our brain that has what we call the executive function, allows us to concentrate. It's the part of our brain that determines whether we're happy or sad, our creativity, our ability to learn, all influenced by the prefrontal lobes of the brain. And by activating it, you find all these things are changed and improved. Well, it turns out that our brain is constantly rewiring itself in response to how we are using it. So the more you meditate, the better you get at meditation, and the more effective it is in helping us. As the prefrontal lobes get activated, we find there's an automatic de-emphasis of the limbic system and all the functions of the limbic system. So you will find someone who might have had anxiety disorders or a tendency toward depression when they first started meditating, and you see them 20 years later, and they have to really think and remember, what did that feel like when I was anxious? Because it takes so much to make me feel anxious now compared to then. The second area I want to talk about is mirror neurons. I'm sorry, I just got the yawns. Did anybody feel like yawning? That was mirror neurons. Actually, I saw this really very interesting little video. A young man who was traveling around the world would go and stand in public places in different cultures and just start yawning, and then film what happened as people walked by. And it was very interesting because some people would sort of say, go get some sleep. In a few cultures, people would come up and sort of chide him for doing something as inappropriate as yawning in public, which I thought was interesting. But many people would pass him, and within 20 feet, they'd yawn themselves. Well, why does that happen, and why is that a spontaneous reflex that we see? Well, we think it's caused by mirror neurons. It turns out that our nervous system is replete. It is resplendent with these shimmering neurons that are constantly monitoring our world around us, and particularly creatures just like us, other human beings. And it's there to help us adapt and harmonize with what's happening around us. In fact, I learned very early on as a physician that I could have my mirror neurons, feel my mirror neurons as I talk to a patient. And often it would give me a lot of insight into what a person was feeling, both emotionally and physically, because I would begin to kind of feel those same things in myself. And it also taught me that you need to really keep your energy up, because someone comes in and they're very angry. It would be easy to have your mirror neurons sort of twitching, shimmering with that same emotion, and begin to feel that same emotion yourself. But many things influence our mirror neurons. Music is one of them that influences them. I don't know how many of you had this sensation, but I remember when I came to the concert on Wednesday night, sitting there, that the moment the choir started singing, there was this sensation that not only should I sing along with them, which I was kind of already doing, but I should just get up there and sing with them. And it was a very odd experience. And I realized mirror neurons, that's part of this urge we feel when we're around people that are behaving in a way similar to what we are. And it influences our behavior and changes our nervous system. So living in a spiritual community really has a big effect on our nervous system that can be very beneficial in supporting Kriya Yoga practice and help us in this accelerating evolution of our nervous system to allow us to experience deeper states of God consciousness. There's one other nerve I would like to talk about in the body, and that's the vagus nerve. And it's an interesting structure. It actually runs from our brain down through the center of our body and plugs into many different organs in our abdomen. And its end position is actually plugging into what we call the enteric nervous system. Turns out there's a whole portion of our nervous system that is applied to our intestines and our colon. And so the bacteria that live in our colon, what we call our microbiome, how those are behaving actually has an influence on our brain function via the vagus nerve. When we do yoga practices like hatha yoga or any of the breathing exercises, pranayama practices for energy control using breath, that much of the physical effect that we feel is via the vagus nerve being affected. In fact, in medicine right now, they're actually putting little stimulators underneath the skin, like you'd put a pacemaker in someone to help control their heart. Actually, they're pacemakers for the vagus nerve, because they found people with seizure disorders can have them controlled, that won't be controlled with medication, that they can actually control them with a vagus nerve pacemaker that fires when they start to have a seizure. People are doing weight loss with it. They're also controlling depression with that. So it shows the importance of the vagus nerve for good health, and we stimulate it naturally and in a very harmonious way when we do our Kriya Yoga practice, particularly the higher Kriyas. For those of you who have the third and fourth Kriya, you may notice that just as you start your exhalation, that you may feel kind of a flushing throughout your upper body and in your abdomen and chest. And some of that is stimulation of the vagus nerve. And I always know I'm doing my Kriyas well, those higher Kriyas well, when I feel that, because I've gotten relaxed enough that that's getting stimulated. Well, how about our microbiome? I touched on this very briefly, and I just want to make a brief comment on this because it was when this first became understood broadly in medicine about 5 years ago, I began to understand why many of Master's specific health recommendations, particularly his dietary recommendations, made sense. Because essentially what we're doing with our Kriya Yoga lifestyle, our lifestyle is Kriya Bonds, one of the things we do is we literally groom our microbiome to have it healthy so that the communication between the bacteria, viruses, and fungi that live in our colon with the rest of our body are really made most efficient and best as possible. It turns out, in fact, it's not just sending small chemical messengers, which we know happens. In fact, again, this is one of those things. We've known for many, many decades that there's these small little units called small chain fatty acids. They're called SCFAs, small chain fatty acids. And we were thought that was just a product of digestion. And it turns out they're messengers, and they actually are important, okay? Another thing you just heard today, small chain fatty acids, okay? And very much impacted by diet. Well, where does our microbiome come from? Where does this, these hitchhikers that we carry along, which actually outnumber us quite considerably in terms of cellular genetics. There's more genetic material in our microbiome than in the rest of our body. Well, it turns out we get that at birth from mothers. So we get the main part of our genetic material from both our parents, but the energy centers in our cells that generate all the energy that our cells operate on physically are actually a specific kind of unit called a mitochondria. And the DNA for that is separate from our main DNA. It's actually much more ancient than our DNA. And we get that only from our mother. So we get two things from our mothers uniquely. One is the start of our microbiome, and the second thing is our mitochondria, or our cellular production of energy. Those come just from mom. It turns out microbiome is very plastic in how it works with the rest of our body, that it's very changeable. In fact, here's the thing that just boggled my mind. It turns out that our body is constantly swapping and exchanging genetic information, DNA, with all the microbiome that you carry. So it's not like you're born with DNA and you die with that DNA. It turns out that DNA is being restructured. It's actually being sculpted by many factors in your life. One is the microbiome. One is the functioning of your nervous system. That also sculpts your microbiome. So living rightly, you have this healthy microbiome, you're following Master's daily diet, you're doing all the things you should for good health. You're also doing your Kriya Yoga practice. It means there's this multifactorial process that's happening to refine us. Well, what about our microbiome? Well, it turns out we share our microbiome with everybody around us. It's kind of a communal thing. And so, and this just happens automatically. We touch things, we share things. This stuff just gets swapped around. It's just happening constantly. And the thing that's interesting about it is, okay, the bacteria that I'm going to be sharing with people is taking on some aspects of my genetics. And I've just passed that on to somebody else. Well, they're getting a little bit of my genetics when I interact with them. Isn't that interesting? Again, it kind of is taking us away from this idea that our genetic material is this rigid, non-changing structure, that it's actually something that has changeability. Built within the DNA, in fact, are genes that are able to turn on or off. When we're born, they come to us in a given state, turned on or off, but with our lifestyle, we may change the position of that switch. Let's say you're someone who was born with the gene that we know is involved with alcoholism, but you're living, you're raised in the Ananda schools, you're practicing Kriya Yoga, and you've never gone down the road of drinking alcohol. Well, at some point, that switch will realize it's not needed and it will turn off. And when that person has children, they're going to pass on that switch in the off position. So they've actually changed their DNA by lifestyle. There was an interesting thing I saw discussed in my medical literature. This was just about 5 years ago, and they were sort of looking at the comparison between human DNA and a chimpanzee's DNA. And they found that actually they're much more similar than I would have guessed. If someone had just asked me off the, as a guess 15 or 20 years ago, I probably would have said something, well, it's probably 85, 90%, pretty close. Well, in fact, it's 98.8%. So there's 1.2% difference in genetic material between us and the chimpanzee. And actually, I told one of my colleagues that, and he said, okay, humans here, chimpanzees here, where do I put surgeons and politicians? So we're actually talking, it was interesting. I was listening to Parvati, how she mentioned as we advance into Dwapara Yuga, people will be living longer, that actually the way their bodies manifest may be different. They may be taller. And is that an unreasonable thing to think about? Don't genetic changes take evolutionarily, don't they take thousands, maybe even millions of years? Genetics are plastic, they're changeable. And we're finding that some of these kinds of changes are not unreasonable to at least consider, just based on what we already know about the changeability of DNA. Last thing I just wanted to mention is exosomes. And I'm just mentioning this because it's very interesting and you're going to hear more about it. Exosomes are tiny little spheres. They're smaller than a red blood cell, quite tiny. They're found in your bloodstream. And they're little spheres coated with fat so that they can travel through your bloodstream without being interfered with by other entities like immune blood cells, white blood cells. And they often contain messenger information, both genetic material and often chemical messengers that flow throughout your body. And it's another way of your body signaling another part of your body with information. A good example of exosomes in action is people who've had a head injury. Someone's fallen over, hit their head, and been unconscious for 20 minutes, and 6 months later, they're finding they're having headaches, they're having depression, their health is not good, they're having all sorts of physical woes, the kind of thing we actually see happen with head injuries. Well, a group of physicians actually looked at this and they found that if you took the blood of people who'd had head injuries and took out the exosomes, these little messenger spherical particles, and you took just the exosomes and you put those into an animal, the animal would almost immediately begin behaving like they had a head injury. They did another experiment where they took animals that were extremely fit, could run on their little hamster wheel for 8 hours a day quite happily. And they took the exosomes out of those animals and they put them in other animals who really didn't have access to much exercise. And what they found is when they exercised the animals that had just gotten these exosomes, that much of the exercise ability that the healthy rats had been transferred to these other rats. So exosomes are something that are coming to us in one more way that we'll probably find that Kriya Yoga and other meditative practices affect us physiologically and transform us for the future. So in summary, I would just say, yes, as individuals, it's unquestionable that physiologically, Kriya Yoga practice is transforming us. But remember, everyone around us benefits. And when we spend time around other Kriya bonds, other people who are meditating and living rightly, they are impacting us. And just remember that little concept of mirror neurons. It's always watching. When you listen to music, when you watch a movie, they're not trying to decide is it a good or a bad thing. When you're watching an exciting movie, they're up there too, trying to adapt to what you're seeing, and they don't know whether it's real or not. So just some food for thought on that. So God bless you all.